Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Do you know your true worth? Because I found out mine in the most unexpected way, standing in the middle of a family barbecue, while my parents lifted their glasses to toast my sister's achievements and skipped over me as though I was invisible. It was not a slip of the tongue, not an accident, not a moment where they simply forgot. No, it was a very intentional, very public gesture, the kind that stings not because of what is said, but because of what is not said. I stood there holding an empty plate, and when the laughter faded and the glasses clinked, I realized that I was not going to protest, I was not going to draw attention to myself, and I was not going to beg for recognition. Instead, I took the plate, I started stacking dishes, and I decided right then that my silence would be my first and most powerful move. While the others were busy congratulating Sophie for yet another milestone, a project I knew had been padded by hours of my own unpaid, uncredited help, I carried trays inside and scrubbed the counters. They believed I was sulking, but I was not sulking. I was cataloging, remembering, and making calculations that I had avoided for years. Every autopay that I had set up, just to help, every tuition installment for my niece that I had agreed to cover until Sophie's job got steady, every subscription, phone line, and digital service that somehow had been attached to my account while no one noticed but me. And suddenly, as I scrubbed the barbecue sauce off a plate that my father had abandoned on the side table, I felt something I had not felt in years: leverage. I want to be clear, I did not speak a single word of confrontation that night. I smiled at the right moments, I nodded when people said goodbye, and I hugged Sophie when she left, letting her believe everything was fine. But when I got home, I opened my laptop and I started going line by line through my bank statements. I found the family phone plan, which had been in my name for nearly a decade because my credit score was better. I found the automatic transfers for Sophie's kids' school, the storage account my mom had once asked me to put on my card temporarily, the house repair that I had covered when my dad said he would pay me back next paycheck, but never mentioned again. I added them all up, and I stared at the number until I felt sick, because it was not a matter of forgetting, it was years of me subsidizing their comfort, all while being erased in front of extended family as though my role was nothing. I did not draft a dramatic message or pour out my feelings. Instead, I prepared simple, clear notices. Each one stated the amount, the service, and the date it would be transferred out of my account. I did not add commentary, I did not accuse anyone, I did not beg. I gave them timelines, instructions, and options. If they wanted to keep those services, they could attach their own card. If they wanted to keep the tuition help, they could arrange another sponsor. If they wanted cloud storage, they could create their own account. And when I finished, I scheduled every message to send at 9 o'clock the following morning so that by the time they finished breakfast, they would be reading not an argument, but an invoice. When I lay down that night, I did not cry and I did not replay the barbecue toast in my head. I thought about the moment Sophie's resume had crossed my desk months earlier, the one she later boasted had landed her a promotion. I thought about how I had rewritten her cover letter from scratch, cut through all the errors, and formatted it so cleanly that even I wanted to hire her. I thought about the nights I stayed late editing her grant proposal while she went out to dinner. None of that had been acknowledged publicly, but it had been crucial to her image. And the truth hit me like a hammer. My family had not simply overlooked me, they had been actively relying on me to stay quiet. I knew exactly what I was doing when I scheduled those changes. I was not punishing anyone. I was removing the cushion they had built on my back. I was pulling away the invisible scaffolding that had held up the entire picture they liked to display to the world. And I was doing it without a word, without drama, without the chance for them to twist the story into me being emotional or jealous. The next morning, I carried on with my day as usual. I went to work, I checked my emails, I answered calls. I ignored the first few texts from my mom asking if I was upset. I ignored my dad's short message telling me he hoped I had cooled off. I waited, because I knew the silence would do more than any speech. And sure enough, that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Sophie, the sister who had sat smiling as our parents toasted her at the barbecue. The text was short, but it made me laugh out loud in the middle of my office. "Mom won't stop crying. Did you say something?" And that was when I knew the game had already shifted, because for once, I had not said a single word. I had simply stopped carrying the weight they never even thanked me for, and it was already shaking the ground under them. When Sophie's message popped up on my screen asking if I had said something because our mother would not stop crying, I stared at it long enough to realize that this was the first time in a long time anyone in my family had paused to consider that a shift in the house might come from action rather than attitude. So I took a breath, chose words that were simple but not small, and replied that I had not spoken to anyone, I had not confronted anyone, and I had not made a speech, because all I had done was change what I was willing to fund and how I was willing to be used, which, if we are being honest, was always the only language that ever moved anything in that house. Sophie tried to pivot into the usual dance where she plays translator for our parents and I play the reasonable older sister who smooths everyone's fear with an apology for a tone I never used, but I did not step onto that floor this time. And instead I sent her a calm explanation that the services attached to my card were being transferred back to the people who used them, that the tuition autopay I had set up during a so-called temporary crunch was paused until a new payee was added, and that the cloud storage our mother insisted she could not live without could be migrated to her own account in one afternoon with customer support, which, conveniently, would teach her the passwords she had avoided learning for years. I told Sophie that none of this required a family summit or a tearful conference call, only ownership, and if our mother was crying then what she was actually feeling was the loss of a cushion she had not acknowledged existed. Because I knew how quickly a story like this can be framed as cruelty or revenge when it is actually boundary setting, I did something that took me exactly 5 minutes and saved me weeks of being painted as unhinged. As I clipped the short video from the barbecue that a cousin had recorded, the one where my parents lifted their glasses to my sister while I was in the corner stacking plates, and I trimmed it to the 10 seconds that mattered. And I stored it as an unlisted link that I shared only with Aunt Brenda, who has never been afraid of plain truth, and with my manager Elena, who knows my work under stress better than anyone, not to expose my parents and not to recruit a jury, but to timestamp reality so that if whispers started about me being dramatic, there was a simple, boring piece of context that said otherwise. In the same hour, because I have learned that empty space invites backtracking, I recorded a short, neutral thank you clip to send to the family group chat, just me in my kitchen saying that the barbecue food was great, that it was nice to see the cousins, that Sophie's milestone was worth celebrating, and that we should all thank the neighbors and Brenda for pitching in on cleanup and setup, which I named aloud because I wanted credit to land where labor had actually occurred rather than where a microphone was available, and then I declined the invitation that arrived almost immediately for a follow-up family dessert night, replying that I would sit that one out and would be spending my time on a local school program that needed donations for basic supplies, after which I redirected the exact amount I had been sending to my niece's tuition into that program in Brenda's name, and sent the receipt to Brenda alone with a line that said this felt better, because it did. Predictably, my mother moved from tears to messages about how I was embarrassing the family by being cold, as if refusing to keep paying for a phone plan registered in my name and used by 4 people was the moral equivalent of a public tantrum. And my father sent one of those tight little notes that pretends to be calm, but is really a warning, saying he hoped I would not do anything rash, while feelings were hot, which made me smile because nothing I had done was rash. I had done spreadsheets. Sophie asked for a call, and for the first time in years I said no. Not yet, not until the changes were understood on paper, and in that same spirit of paper over performance I attached a 1-page summary to the family email detailing dates and steps. No commentary and no blame, which is when the group chat went silent in that heavy way that tells you someone is dialing phones behind the scenes to build a counter-narrative, and I went back to my actual job where people say thank you when I do something useful and nobody forgets my name on purpose. Around late afternoon, Elena swung by my desk and told me my LinkedIn post draft about invisible labor and burnout, the one I had written weeks ago and never posted, could be a good way to reclaim my own story without naming anyone. And even though I was tempted, I saved it for later because I did not want to escalate anything that day, but I did want to be ready if a wave of gossip arrived. And as we were talking, my phone lit up with a call from an unknown number that I let roll to voicemail. Because I have learned that nothing urgent arrives without a text first. And a minute later, the transcription showed up with a single sentence in my father's clipped voice that made my scalp prickle, even though I had expected it since the moment I pressed send on those transfers. We need to talk about the accounts. When I finally listened to my father's voicemail in full, the one where his voice carried that clipped, managerial tone he always used when bills or obligations were about to be discussed, I knew instantly that the conversation he wanted was not about emotions or the family barbecue or even the fact that my mother had apparently cried all night, but rather about the concrete reality of accounts, signatures, and obligations that, for years, had been quietly attached to my name. For a long time, I had allowed myself to believe that co-signing a small home equity line was a gesture of trust, a way of showing loyalty to my parents during what they described as a temporary financial storm. But what had been sold to me as a stopgap solution had become a pipeline for quiet dependency that grew year after year without a single check-in or acknowledgement. And when I finally pulled the credit statements and looked at the numbers with clear eyes, the so-called emergency fund had matured into something much larger, leaving me carrying liability for decisions I had not made, for expenses I had not approved, and for debts that were not mine. I remember sitting in the bank lobby with a folder of papers I had gathered the night before, watching families move in and out with their children, thinking about how many of those parents had probably made the same quiet mistakes of mixing their children's resources with their own, and I knew I was about to cross the line from helpful daughter to someone who drew an actual legal boundary. The loan officer, a woman in her 40s with a direct way of speaking that I immediately respected, asked me what I wanted, and for the first time in my life in that context, I said I wanted protection, I wanted separation, and I wanted the ability to walk away from my family's financial choices without being pulled into court or debt collectors' offices. Together we reviewed the options, and within an hour I had initiated a refinance on my portion, effectively cutting my liability and placing a freeze on any further draws until all parties could meet and restructure under fair terms. It was clinical, it was procedural, but it was also the first time I had chosen myself in a financial room that my parents thought I would always surrender to. After leaving the bank, I stopped for coffee and opened my laptop because I knew money was only one thread, and I wanted to start pulling the others before they tightened into knots I could not undo. For years, my parents had insisted that I take responsibility for their small business website, that I be the one who paid for hosting, managed passwords, and updated the pages whenever they wanted to advertise a seasonal service, all under the argument that I was the tech-savvy one. What they never admitted was that the site, the account, and the entire online presence legally belonged to me, tied to my email and my payment information, and that if anything went wrong, I would be the one liable for data, billing, or even fraud. So I drafted a polite, professional message, attached a detailed step-by-step guide for how to transfer ownership, and then I revoked my administrator access so that from that day forward, they would be the sole owners of their own digital face to the world. When I pressed send, I felt the strange kind of calm that comes when you know someone will call you ungrateful or cold, but you also know you have taken the only step that can protect your future. And sure enough, that evening an email arrived from my mother with a single line that read, "If you loved this family, you would not do this." There was no acknowledgement of the years I had kept their bills current, no mention of the countless nights I stayed up troubleshooting their business emails, no recognition that love had been the very reason I had said yes to every request. Only a weaponized sentence designed to drag me back into the role of silent provider. But what she did not understand was that I had already prepared my countermeasure, not in words, but in documents. Earlier that day, I had met briefly with a lawyer, a quiet man with a precise way of cataloging debts and assets, and together we had drafted a letter to Linda and Ray Carter. It was not dramatic, it was not accusatory, and it did not carry the language of anger. Instead, it was the cleanest summary I had ever seen of what had transpired: dates, receipts, obligations, and a proposal to dissolve the financial entanglements in a structured, lawful manner. It invited them to meet with neutral witnesses on 2 possible dates. It noted clearly that any attempt to open new debt in my name would be immediately disputed and reported. And it established in writing the fact that I was no longer the daughter who could be guilt into carrying everyone else's weight. The letter was respectful but immovable, and once it had been delivered, I knew the ground had shifted permanently. That night, when I sat on my couch reading my mother's email again, I realized that her sentence was not really about love but about control, because in her mind, love meant sacrifice, love meant silence. Love meant me doing the things she did not want to do and absorbing the consequences she did not want to face. And maybe for years I had let that definition stand, but as I stared at the stack of documents on my coffee table, refinance papers, website transfer guides, legal letters, I understood that I had finally replaced sentiment with structure. I had traded guilt for evidence, and once evidence is in motion, no amount of crying can reverse it. What none of them seemed to grasp yet was that I was not out to punish. I was not trying to embarrass them or to humiliate anyone. I was simply shutting off the quiet pipelines that had been draining me dry. And as the silence from their end stretched into the night, I realized I was not afraid anymore, because the next move would not be a tearful confrontation in a living room. It would be a meeting at a table with documents, witnesses, and signatures. The era of whispered requests and late-night guilt trips was over, and for once, I was the one drawing the line in ink. When the letter from my attorney landed in their inbox, I knew that it would not simply sit quietly and be processed like an ordinary piece of correspondence, because in our family, paper has always carried more threat than words. And instead of inspiring cooperation, it immediately ignited the kind of whisper campaign I had anticipated from the moment I decided to protect myself. Within days, a cousin messaged me saying she had heard I was cutting my parents off, that I was trying to ruin their business, and that I was cold in a way that only ungrateful children could be. And I understood that my mother and father had wasted no time framing my decision not as self-preservation but as betrayal. What they had not anticipated, however, was that I had already learned the value of narrative, and I was no longer content to let my life be described by people who depended on my silence. Instead of writing a dramatic defense or engaging in point-by-point arguments with relatives who had never once paid my bills, I chose a subtler and far more effective path. I opened the LinkedIn draft I had saved weeks earlier, the one Elena had nudged me to post, and I rewrote it until it said exactly what I needed it to, that invisible labor is real. That families and workplaces often rely on people who never get credited for their contributions, and that sometimes the only way to survive is to say no, even when no feels like betrayal to those who benefited from your yes. I did not name my family, I did not reference the barbecue or the accounts, but I knew anyone who had ever been in my position would read between the lines, and when I pressed post, the response was instant. Colleagues commented with stories of their own, old friends messaged me with support, and Elena herself left a note about my reliability, professionalism, and quiet strength, which carried more weight than any. Whisper My Parents could circulate in church groups or neighborhood circles. That one post shifted the ground, because while my parents tried to paint me as the villain in private spaces, I had strengthened my reputation in public ones, and reputation, once cemented, is hard to undo. The timing could not have been better, because a local nonprofit saw the post, reached out, and asked if I would be willing to speak briefly at a community event about burnout and boundaries, and for the first time in my life, my story was being invited into a room where it would not be mocked, silenced, or minimized. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a growing conviction that my parents' approval was no longer the highest form of validation I could seek. The event itself was modest, a small gathering at the library, but when I stood at the podium and spoke about the toll of carrying obligations that were never acknowledged, about the way silence becomes a trap, and about how saying no had saved my career and possibly my health, I felt something break loose in me. I ended my talk not with a plea for sympathy but with an announcement that I had redirected funds I once spent on obligations nobody thanked me for into a scholarship fund for kids in the district who needed supplies, and that the very first donation was being made in the name of my Aunt Brenda, because she had always been the one relative unafraid to tell the truth aloud. The room applauded, People nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt my labor translate into something tangible that could not be twisted into selfishness or cruelty. What I did not anticipate was that someone recorded that brief speech, posted it online, and within hours it had circulated back to my family, where my mother took it not as a gesture of community service, but as public humiliation. She accused me of mocking them, of washing family laundry in front of strangers, and she told Sophie that I had intentionally tried to shame them. Of course, Sophie, caught between loyalty and image, decided to carry that message directly to me. Late that night, she appeared at my door, her eyes red from crying, her voice caught between anger and exhaustion, and she said, "They told me you humiliated them in public." In that moment, looking at my sister, I realized the true stakes had shifted again. This was no longer just about money or legal documents or even reputation. It was about identity, about who we were going to be in each other's lives going forward. My parents had escalated the narrative to the point where reconciliation on their terms would mean me erasing everything I had just built, and my sister, whether she admitted it or not, had been pushed into the role of messenger and enforcer. I invited her inside, not to argue, not to defend myself, but because I knew the next conversation had to be quiet, calm, and undeniable, and for that, I had been preparing a binder full of receipts, bank alerts, and original messages for years. As she sat down across from me, I slid it across the table, and though I had not yet opened my mouth, I knew the story was about to move from rumor to proof, from whispers to reality, and that nothing, no toast, no gossip, no tears, would be able to erase what she was about to see. When Sophie sat at my kitchen table staring at the binder I had slid across to her, the silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever had, because unlike raised voices or bitter accusations, paper leaves no room for denial. And as she flipped through pages of bank alerts, receipts, copies of messages, and notes I had kept over the years, I could see her face shifting from defensiveness to unease, and then finally to something closer to recognition. For so long, she had been told, and perhaps wanted to believe, that her successes were entirely her own, that the speeches made in her honor were genuine tributes to her individual brilliance. But when confronted with the unedited reality of how many times I had stayed up reworking her grant proposals, transferring money to cover gaps, handling services that carried her name while billed under mine, she could not escape the truth that the life she had been celebrated for was built in large part on invisible scaffolding I had quietly provided. I told her that I was not asking for thanks, not asking for repayment, and not even asking for an apology, because those things, while emotionally satisfying, were not what this moment required. What I wanted was clarity, permanence, and rules that would hold even when emotions flared. I explained calmly that going forward there would be no more phone calls at midnight begging me to fix financial emergencies, no more obligations hidden under the label of family duty, no more guilt-ridden speeches about what love required me to do, and above all, no more expectation that I would sacrifice my stability for the comfort of people who refused to admit what I had already given. My terms were simple but non-negotiable. I would remain in their lives if they wanted me, but it would be as a sister and daughter, not as a lender, guarantor, or unpaid administrator. She asked if I was cutting our parents off completely, and I told her no, because even though part of me wanted the clean break, another part knew that to walk away entirely would allow them to twist the story into something easier for them to accept. Some narrative about an ungrateful daughter who abandoned them in their old age. Instead, I explained that I had arranged for a third-party advisor to manage a modest monthly support stipend, a controlled amount that could never again be inflated by hidden bills or secret loans, and that this money would flow without my direct involvement, which meant no more emergency calls routed through me, no more manipulative appeals to my sense of duty, and no more conflation of love with financial servitude. In other words, I was removing myself from the role of rescuer without leaving them destitute, and in doing so, I was making sure that the narrative of abandonment would not hold. Sophie sat quietly, flipping pages again, and I could see her calculating the implications not just for our parents, but for herself, because if I was stepping out of the shadow role, She would either have to step into the light of truth and admit how much of her success was subsidized, or she would have to continue pretending, which, in light of the evidence in front of her, would eventually collapse under its own weight. I told her plainly that this was her choice, not mine. She could either keep the crown they had given her and carry the weight of knowing it was hollow, or she could tell the truth, admit the extent of my contributions, and perhaps rebuild something honest. I said that I would not push, would not beg, and would not wait forever, but that the door was open for her to choose integrity. To my surprise, she did not argue. She did not defend herself with the usual lines about being the younger child, about being less financially stable, about needing my help just until she was established. Instead, she sat very still, and after a long pause, she picked up her phone and opened the family group chat. I watched as she typed a message with trembling hands. I was wrong. A lot of my wins were built on Maya's work. We need to fix this. And then she pressed send. The silence that followed was almost cinematic, the little typing bubble appearing and disappearing as our parents undoubtedly hovered, unsure how to respond, until finally Aunt Brenda, true to form, broke the silence with a single line. "We'll see you both at the meeting with the attorney." I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath I had been holding for years, because in that moment, I realized that I had not just reclaimed my boundaries, I had changed the terms of engagement entirely. No longer was I the silent provider waiting for scraps of acknowledgement. I was now the one who had defined the rules, laid out the evidence, and offered a path forward that was firm, fair, and immune to manipulation. My victory did not come from shouting louder, from cutting ties in a blaze of drama, or from humiliating anyone publicly, but from the quiet, consistent application of truth and structure, the kind that cannot be undone by tears or gossip. As Sophie sat across from me, still holding the binder as if it were heavier than its actual weight, I realized that I had never needed applause at a barbecue or a toast in front of relatives to validate my worth. What I had needed was exactly what I had built for myself, a life where my contributions were acknowledged, my limits respected, and my value measured not in how much I could silently carry, but in how effectively I could decide when to put the weight down. And with that realization came the final sentence I spoke aloud that night, one that surprised even me in its simplicity. I never raised my voice. I just stopped being useful in the ways that made me invisible. That was the end of it, not because every conflict had been resolved, not because my parents had suddenly seen the light, but because the game had changed, and I had changed it. For the first time in my life, I was not waiting for permission, forgiveness, or recognition. I had already won, not by breaking ties, but by breaking the cycle, and in doing so, I left the table not as the overlooked daughter, but as the woman who finally defined her own worth.